Stone by stone, the weight of silence became his gallows. He spoke no confession, and died with his ribs shattered and tongue swollen black. In the fall of 1692, amid the fevered hysteria of the Salem witch trials, an old man named Giles Corey became an unwilling martyr. A prosperous farmer in his 80s, Giles was accused of witchcraft by the same town he had once helped govern. But unlike the dozens who broke under pressure, Giles chose silence. What followed was not a hanging, but a death by torture, crushed slowly beneath heavy stones over 3 harrowing days. His refusal to confess made him a symbol of resistance, but his end was one of the most agonizing punishments ever inflicted on American soil. There was a time when Giles Corey's name carried weight in Salem, not the crushing kind, not yet, but the quiet gravity of an aging landowner whose boots sank deep into the earth he had claimed, and whose voice could still bring silence to a quarrel at the meeting-house door. He was no saint, and no one called him such. He was known for a heavy hand, for a scowl that deepened with age, for a temper that did not soften with prayer. But he owned land, wore clean clothes on the Sabbath, and raised no open suspicion. He was a man of the church, a man who tithed, a man whose cattle were counted each season with precision. Yet shadows clung to him, even before the first whisper of witchcraft thickened in the Massachusetts air. Years earlier, he had been tried for beating his own servant to death, a crude punishment gone too far. The court had murmured, but not far enough to hang him. His neighbors watched him differently after that, not because they feared the devil, but because they feared what a man might do when the law forgave him. Then the girls began to scream. By the spring of 1692, the trees had not yet turned, but the town already burned. Not with fire, but with suspicion. A sickness passed mouth to mouth, neighbor to neighbor, until even the smallest glance could be twisted into a curse. Giles watched the first trials unfold with a farmer's scowl and a magistrate's spine. He spoke cautiously. At first, he believed the devil might be at work. After all, strange things did happen in these woods, and God had turned his face from worse places. But he also watched how easily truth broke under fear. One girl fainted in court, and a woman lost her name. A doll found in a field became a death sentence. And then came Martha. His wife, stern, pious, unflinching, had laughed during a testimony. That was enough. They said she had mocked the afflicted, that her laughter was unnatural, that it struck one girl dumb for 3 days. Giles, confused, attempted to testify in court, to explain, to shield, to reason. But reason had long fled Salem. His words were twisted, misquoted, turned against him. He had said Martha read strange books at night, meaning the Bible. He had said she murmured to herself before sleep, meaning her prayers. Now the court said Giles Corey had incriminated his own wife, and just like that, the weight of his name collapsed in on itself. Within a week, the charges turned. Someone whispered that Giles' silence during a sermon was unholy, that his cattle refused his touch, that his eyes lingered too long on the afflicted girls in the meeting house. It didn't matter that he was near 80. It didn't matter that he barely heard anymore, or that his hands shook as he carved his initials into his toolshed door. Once named, a man could not be unnamed. The court demanded a plea, guilty or not guilty. Giles refused, not out of cowardice, but calculation. If he spoke, he believed, they would take his land. His name would be erased from his will. His sons would inherit nothing. The courts fed not just on bodies but on property, and Giles, stubborn, wounded, proud, would give them neither. He said nothing. He simply stood in the courtroom, back bowed but unbroken, and offered no reply. The judges murmured. The crowd stirred. The sheriff stepped forward and reminded Giles of an ancient punishment, older than English law, older than the colony itself. Pain forte adieu, pressing under heavy stones until a plea was forced from the lungs or silence became final. Giles did not blink. He turned his head slightly, perhaps toward the benches where Martha had once sat, perhaps to the rafters where dust swirled in the pale light, and said nothing still. That silence would echo louder than any confession, and soon, It would speak through shattered ribs and purpled flesh. The weight of his own name, once carried with pride through Salem's fields, was now a burden he would bear stone by stone, until nothing remained but bone and defiance. The air in Salem gaol did not move. It hung thick and sour, stitched with the stench of unwashed flesh, rotting teeth, old wounds, and the metallic tang of chamber pots spilled long ago and never cleaned. The walls bled with condensation, not fresh water, but the sweat of centuries trapped in stone, and every surface, from rusted iron bars to crumbling mortar, was slick to the touch, cold as the grave and alive with mildew. Giles Corey had been a strong man once, built of the same earth he farmed, wide-backed, weather-toughened, stubborn, in the way only age and toil could produce. But in the belly of the gaol, he was a shadow of that man. His shirt clung wetly to his chest, the linen stiff with dried sweat and filth. His legs, once tree trunks beneath him, were now hollowed from hunger, shaking as he rose to piss in the dark. Even that had become a ritual of shame. No corner was truly private, and the rats were always watching. By the second night, Giles stopped counting the bruises. The jailer, a thick-armed man who said little and spat often, had brought him a wedge of bread slick with green fuzz and a clay cup filled with water that smelled faintly of stagnant pond. He drank it anyway. Hunger was louder than pride. His stomach clawed at itself, and his bowels had loosened to a pale burning liquid that ran down his legs when he wasn't quick enough. All around him, voices, some human, some not. The accused, a tangle of ruined souls huddled against the walls, murmured to themselves in broken loops, clawing prayers into the stone with bloodied nails, or whispering to phantoms only they could see. A girl of no more than 14 screamed into her own hands until they bled. She had been found dancing in the woods, they said, and now claimed her bones were burning from the inside out. One man recited the Lord's Prayer backward through cracked lips, eyes wide and unblinking, a Puritan farmer driven mad by dreams of goats speaking in Latin. And then there were the nights when Giles heard her, a woman's voice, husky, cracked from thirst, but unmistakably hers, drifting through the slits in the stone like a thread of wind. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, it would pause, falter, begin again, always in a whisper, Martha, or what was left of her. He never called out to it. He didn't trust his own ears anymore. One evening, as the moon rose, full, swollen like a dead man's belly, a shaft of silver light poured through the grated vent above him. It cast long, sickle-shaped shadows across the floor, illuminating the lice crawling on the skin of a man sleeping nearby, whose eyelids fluttered with fevered dreams. Giles stared upward, until his neck ached. He watched the dust dance in the beam of light, and he imagined the weight, not abstract anymore, not some whispered threat, but real, a slab pressing down cold and deliberate, turning his chest into pulp. In his sleep, if what he experienced could be called sleep, Giles felt the pressure already, a phantom pain blooming between his ribs, a scream that didn't reach his throat. He dreamed of being buried alive, but upright, mouth filled with dirt, eyes wide open, tongue cut out, and served on a wooden plate, before a silent crowd of judges. He awoke to a shout, a woman crying that the devil had climbed into her womb, and realized he had bitten his own lip. Blood filled his mouth, coppery and warm. He didn't speak of his dreams. No one in the gaol did. Words had power here, not the kind that saved, but the kind that marked. A muttered curse could bring a rope. A question could summon a gallows. The jailer passed once more, keys jangling like bones. He did not look inside. The door groaned as it latched, and the room returned to silence, broken only by the low whimpering of the dying and the scratching of vermin in the straw. Giles curled into himself, spine pressed to the freezing wall, fingers twitching with remembered labor. He had dug ditches with those hands, cut wood, held his wife, but here, they trembled like a child's. He did not know when they would come for him, but he knew what they would bring. Not a trial, not a priest. They would bring the stones, and lay them one by one, until the weight of silence crushed what little voice he had left. The morning was not silent. It carried the low rustle of cartwheels through wet grass, the scuff of boots dragging a man's body, and the hollow cries of crows circling above the gallows field. The sun had only just broken the horizon, casting long, pale fingers of light across the frost-laced mud, and already the soil steamed underfoot. They brought Giles Corey out with chains wrapped tight around his wrists now swollen and yellowed, skin split beneath the iron. His breath came in short bursts, clouding in the chill, and his linen shirt, the only garment left to him, clung to his frame like a burial shroud soaked in sweat. The field behind Salem Gal had been cleared just for this, a place where no tree offered shade and no church bell could interrupt. Sheriff George Corwin stood at the edge of the clearing with a scroll in hand, his voice sharp, official, and without tremor as he read the order for peine forte adure, a punishment reserved for those who refused to confess. It was not a sentence, the sheriff reminded them, but a method of persuasion. Giles said nothing. They forced him to the ground, face up, spine pressed into the chilled earth that sucked warmth from his bones like a leech. His hands were spread outward and bound with coarse rope to iron stakes. He did not resist, though the ligaments in his shoulders stretched with each tightening pull. His ribs, already prominent from starvation, rose and fell with labored effort as he watched the sky, a dull, expressionless gray, cracked only by the black silhouettes of vultures hovering with terrible patience. Then came the board, a thick, untreated oak plank, heavy with damp and stained from previous use. It was laid across his chest with a practiced weight, pinning his sternum flat. He let out a hiss, low, teeth clenched, more reflex than pain. The sheriff motioned, and two men lifted the first stone, round and mottled, about the size and shape of a human skull, and dropped it onto the board without ceremony. A deep grunt tore from Giles' throat, forced past clenched teeth. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and for a moment he thought his heart had stopped. His vision blurred, his ears rang. Then, breath returned, shallow, ragged. Another stone, this one flatter, heavier. It landed with a dull thump, and the wood groaned against his chest. His ribs bowed inward, cartilage strained. His skin had begun to flush purple beneath the plank. The cold of the morning was gone. Now his whole body pulsed with a feverish heat that came not from within, but from the compression, from blood forced into places it did not belong. The sheriff stepped closer, boots sinking into the mud beside Giles' head. He knelt, voice low. "What is your plea?" No answer. Giles opened his mouth, and a thread of blood rolled from his lips. His tongue had thickened, not from injury, but from pressure, swelling in his throat like a dead man's eye, pushed from its socket. Still, no word came, only breath, harsh, wet, and silence. A third stone, this one cracked something. It was not a clean sound, more a tearing, a splintering from deep inside. Giles stiffened, his legs twitched against the stakes. A thin, high whine escaped him, barely human, and then stopped. His eyes rolled upward, but he did not scream. He would not give them that. The crowd gathered in quiet rows along the field's edge. Some turned their heads. The baker's wife wept into her shawl. Others stared without blinking, pale as linen, watching the slow rise and fall of Giles' chest shorten with each added weight. The creak of the plank, the dull, wet cough, the smell, not yet of death, but of meat bruised beyond healing, began to thicken in the air. A boy, no more than 10, whispered to his father that the devil must be under the stones, and the man struck him hard across the ear to silence the thought. Giles' teeth had begun to shift in their sockets. His jaw trembled under the force, and his breath gurgled now, spittle flecked with red. Still, he stared upward, unmoving, as though his soul had already risen, leaving only the ruined vessel below. Again the sheriff spoke. "Plea, Master Corey." No answer, only the creak of wood, the whisper of another stone being lifted, the sound of a man turning into something less than human, by inches and by pounds. By the second morning the dew had turned to frost, and the ground beneath Giles Corey had hardened to stone. His skin, once flushed crimson with blood forced upward by the weight, now took on the mottled hue of decaying plum. Deep purple pooled beneath the board that crushed his chest, rimmed with yellow-green along his flanks, where the vessels had already burst and bled inward. The color of dying things. He no longer breathed in any way that resembled life. His chest did not rise. It merely spasmed, small trembling pulses that came without rhythm or reason, just the body trying, failing again and again, to find air beneath the unrelenting mass. The oak board had splintered slightly in the middle, where the pressure drove bone against wood. A smear of blood had begun to seep outward from under it. Slow, thick, dark, not from a single wound but from everywhere at once. His jaw hung slack now. The muscles had stopped obeying. His tongue, once a man's tool for argument and curse, for plea and denial, had swollen grotesquely in his mouth, black at the tip, bloated and pushing against broken teeth, forcing open his lips with its own dead weight. Flies had gathered, drawn not just by the blood, but by the stench of loosened bowels, of skin beginning to rot, while the man inside still breathed. They crawled along the corners of his eyes, drank from the wet of his nostrils, nested in his matted beard. Giles could not lift his head. He had tried once, yesterday perhaps, or an hour ago, but the pain had ripped like fire across his neck and down his spine, and he had fallen into a kind of blind, grinding darkness. Now he drifted in and out, not of sleep, but of something colder, a place where sound faded and sensation became confusion, where time was measured not in minutes but in stones. He thought he heard Martha's voice again. It came not from above or behind, but from within, the kind of whisper that lives in marrow. She said nothing, just breathed. It might have been the wind, or the devil, or memory collapsing under pressure, like his ribs. The next stone was different, larger, not shaped to fit. It was dragged, not carried, and left deep furrows in the soil where it had been hauled. Two men strained to lift it. It teetered briefly above him, silhouetted against the sky, blotting out the pale sun, and then dropped. The sound was not like the others, not a thud, not a crack. It was a snap, brittle and sickening, followed by a wet sucking noise as air was forced violently from his lungs, and a choked cough rattled through his throat, thick with fluid. A rib had broken, maybe more. The onlookers knew it, by the way his body jerked once, and then stilled. One woman screamed, another turned and vomited into the weeds. A young boy clutched his mother's skirts and refused to look. The sheriff, George Corwin, did not flinch. His lips curled, not in a smile, but in something colder, satisfaction veiled as duty. He crouched beside the dying man, leaned close enough to hear the rattling breath, the gurgle in the throat that signaled a lung filling with its own blood. "Speak, Master Corey," he said, voice low, casual, as though offering terms in a contract. Giles' lips parted. His face was swollen, the eyes bloodshot and bulging, the veins in his temples throbbing visibly beneath the skin. He drew in what little air he could, not enough for a word, only for a rasp, but he shaped it anyway. Not a confession, not surrender. More weight. It came out as barely a whisper, jagged with pain, muffled by the clotted mass of his tongue, and the fluid that now drowned his voice. But it was heard, enough to freeze the moment, enough for those present to remember. The reverend standing by the edge of the crowd began to whisper a psalm, something about mercy, about judgment, but the words faltered, slid from his tongue, like water over stone. His eyes were fixed on the man beneath the board, and there was no God in that field now, only bones, blood, and a silence that defied scripture. Giles Corey had not confessed, not to men, not to God. He had become something else, not martyr, not madman, but symbol, a creature flattened by law, and held upright, by spite, by pride, by something so deeply human, it no longer resembled humanity. Above them, the sky held its breath, as if waiting for the next stone. By the third morning, the body beneath the stones was no longer that of a man. It had become a grotesque altar to silence, stretched and crushed, until only the thinnest thread connected breath to flesh. Giles Corey no longer groaned. He no longer opened his eyes. His skin, once hardened by sun and work, had split open in places where the jagged edge of shattered ribs pressed outward from within, forming small ruptures that oozed a watery pink fluid and stank of meat gone to rot. The smell was unbearable, a foul stew of ruptured intestines, spilled urine, and sweat trapped beneath the board for over 40 hours. The earth around him had turned to a thick sludge, blackened and soaked with bodily filth. A swarm of flies clung to the bloody foam on his lips, feeding on the mucus that pooled in the corners of his mouth and bubbled when he tried, and failed, to draw air. His breeches had long since been soiled. Sometime during the night, his bladder had released, followed by his bowels, and the effluent now steamed in the morning cold. The board itself, once clean and smooth, had warped under the pressure and soaked through with blood, both human and animal in appearance. The grain of the wood was now dark, glistening, streaked with fat and dark clots, as though the very plank had begun to rot in communion with its victim. Sheriff George Corwin stood near the head of the execution site, eyes fixed on Giles' slack jaw, where a thread of saliva hung frozen in place. The sheriff's boots were stained with mud and waste, and his nostrils twitched with every breath, but he showed no outward discomfort. In his hand, he held the order again, not to read, but as a symbol, a shield. His authority had begun to tremble beneath the weight of public horror. The gathered crowd, smaller now, hushed, stood farther back than before. Even the boldest among them, who had shouted curses and judgments on the first day, now clung to each other in uneasy silence. The child who had watched on the first morning was gone. His mother had taken him away after Giles began to choke on his own tongue. A few women remained, holding kerchiefs to their noses, crossing themselves every time the old man wheezed. "Speak, Giles," the sheriff said again, but the voice had lost its edge. It landed flat in the morning air, like a prayer whispered too late at a closed coffin. Giles' mouth opened. No words came, only a hiss, wet, shallow, the sound of lungs filled with blood and failing tissue. His lips trembled, peeled back to show blackened gums and loose teeth, then nothing. No further breath. His jaw dropped. His chest gave one last lurch beneath the board. A twitch, no more than the recoil of a nerve. His eyes, already yellowed and rimmed in blood, stared upward at nothing. A final fly crept into the socket of his right eye and did not come back out. The sheriff motioned. A final stone, heavier than all the others, square and deliberate, was brought forward by two men, whose faces were ghost-pale and drained of speech. Together they heaved it atop the rest. It landed with a solid thunk, and there was no movement beneath, not even a ripple. No one cheered. No one wept. The air was thick with the smell of blood and ash. Someone had begun to burn the straw used for the previous day's restraint. Behind the field, the church bells remained silent. Even the wind had stopped. "Dead," Corwin said, his voice barely above a breath, as if admitting defeat. "He is dead." They stripped the body. The fabric tore away in wet strips, revealing skin blackened in patches, raw where the rope had cut into wrists and ankles. The flesh had begun to peel in places. A nail had torn off entirely, exposing bone. They dug no grave, only a shallow ditch behind the gale, barely deeper than the length of a man's forearm. He was dumped in, his arms twisted beneath him, his head turned sharply to one side, as though he were still listening for the next stone. There was no prayer, no priest, no marker. The board, warped, blood-slick and saturated, was tossed onto a pyre and set alight. The flame took quickly, the wood cracked and hissed, and the smoke curled upward, thick and acrid, smelling of fat and old iron. That night, it rained, a soft misting rain that dampened the ground and clung to skin. And still, the air smelled of blood, of judgment, of smoke. Salem had buried a man who had spoken no plea, and in doing so had unleashed a silence that no sentence could absolve. It began not with thunder or omen, but with a silence too thick to be called peace. A silence that spread like mildew in the corners of houses, in the spaces between prayers, in the cracked lips of judges who once barked confessions into being. Giles Corey had not spoken, and now the entire town of Salem seemed to be holding its breath, as if his final silence had infected the air itself. Sheriff George Corwin was the first to feel it, not in conscience, for his sleep remained undisturbed by guilt, but in the rot that bloomed unseen beneath his skin. Less than a year after Giles' death, Corwin collapsed without warning in his own home, his face contorted mid-step, mouth frozen in a grimace that no witness could unsee. The physician who examined the corpse by candlelight later refused to speak of what he saw, but a servant girl whispered that the skin along Corwin's chest had turned black, not bruised, but stained, as if burned from the inside. His fingernails had gone gray, his tongue was swollen, his body bled from the gums. The same weight he had ordered laid upon Giles now seemed to settle over his own corpse, bloating it, darkening it, pressing it into a grotesque imitation of the man he had condemned. The family, once proud and prominent, began to unravel. The Corwin estate fell into disrepair, its beams warped, windows cracked, and cellar flooded even in drought. Those who entered reported sudden chills, the sensation of being watched, of being judged. One maid, hired to clean the hearth, fled in tears after hearing groans from the stone floor beneath the fireplace. A sound, she said, like breath forced from crushed lungs. The home was soon abandoned. Children dared each other to knock upon the door and whisper more weight through the keyhole, only to run screaming when the latch clicked open of its own accord. Outside the walls of the jail and courthouse, the land itself began to wither. Cattle miscarried without cause. Wheat grew mold black before harvest. Rain came too often, or not at all. Entire fields turned to muck or dust, and old men spat on their boots and muttered that no ground could grow clean where such death had sunk. They said Giles had cursed the soil with his silence, not in incantation, but in sacrifice, and that the earth had swallowed his pain like seed. The trials, once so fervent and absolute, began to buckle. A juror who had voted guilty against Martha Corey threw himself into the river, raving that he saw Giles in the reeds, his face half buried in water, whispering scripture in a tongue that bled. One magistrate, when pressed about spectral evidence, admitted in private he no longer believed. Another claimed he dreamed each night of a board, pressing slowly onto his chest, the pressure growing until he woke screaming with the taste of iron in his throat. Spectral evidence, once accepted without question, became suspect. Witnesses began to recant. Families who had once accused now begged for pardon. The governor, sensing the shift, issued a halt to the proceedings. The court, once fat with power, found itself hollowed by doubt. The rope makers, who had worked without rest through the summer, now stood idle beside stacks of unused hemp. None of them spoke Giles Corey's name aloud, not in prayer, not in court, not even in confession, but they felt it. Every time a shadow passed across a judge's bench, every time the bell of death failed to ring true, every time an empty chair creaked in a room with no wind, they felt it. He had said nothing, not guilty, not innocent, not a single cry. And in that silence, he had carved a curse deeper than any spoken word, a warning laid not on parchment, but on bone. Salem had crushed a man beneath stones and expected submission. Instead, they buried a martyr. And from that grave, a dread had risen that no sermon could contain. The weight was still there, not in stone, but in memory, heavy, permanent, waiting. The death of Giles Corey marked a turning point in the Salem witch trials. His brutal execution, witnessed by both loyalists and skeptics, shocked the colony and raised questions about the legality and morality of spectral evidence. His refusal to plead robbed the courts of their power, and his death became a rallying cry for resistance against unchecked theocratic authority. In the years that followed, reparations were quietly offered to his descendants, but the town never recovered from the stain. The press field vanished beneath weeds, the jail rotted, and Salem's name became forever linked to fear, injustice, and the stones that crushed a man who chose to say nothing.